Welcome, everyone, to the first session of Iperion's webinar series. And to start off, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us today. Brought to you in this session is an outline of the possible improvements you as a department or organization can make to best optimize the use of your regulatory information system, or also known as RIM system. My name is L.Zhu. I am consultant and marketing lead at Iperion Life Sciences Consultancy, and I will be your host today. The agenda is as follows. Firstly, we will briefly address our perspective on the recent EMA events within the IDMP arena. Following that, we will lay out our definition of the so-called RIM system. Furthermore, we will illustrate some trends observed from both regulators and industry that you should definitely consider putting on your radar. Finally, the webinar concludes with 4 basic improvements you can make to optimize the use of your RIM system. However, before we start, I would like to inform you that any questions that arise throughout the presentation, please send it over via the chat function to the organizer. If time allows, of course, we will address a selected number, if not all, of the questions that have been raised. So, with no further ado, I would like to give the floor to today's speaker, Fritz Stolp.
Thank you, Linian. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Thank you for joining. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Fritz Stolp. I'm the Managing Director of Iperion Life Sciences Consultancy. I've done a lot of IDMP work over the past 5 to 6 years, starting with a lot of ex-EVMPD work. And recently, I've been able to take over from Andrew, starting officially in November, as the IDMP topic group lead within IRIS. And next to that, working with many clients, some vendors, but also at many of the conferences on IDMP initiatives. So thank you for being here today. Like Linian also mentioned, please feel free to add any comments or questions that you may have during the session so we can incorporate them and address them at the end. And I'd like to take you through today's webinar. Next slide, please. So, what are we addressing today? Well, first of all, we'd like to take a brief look at the current IDMP environment, which of course has a lot of impact on discussions on regulatory information management. But we'd really like to focus on what have we learned from the many RIMS implementations that we've done, and of course the interactions we've had with many both vendors and clients that have gone through that. Finally, we will end with informing you about who we are and what materials you can download from us in relation to this webinar and what webinars will follow. Next slide, please. I think we're all aware of the fact that over the past number of months, unfortunately, the steps that we were expecting within the IDMP arena did not take place at the speed that we would have liked. There have been a number of decisions coming from the EMA side, many of those driven through Brexit delay, to not take the steps that we were expecting, which means there's a lot of focus on OMS and RMS implementation and far less focus at this moment on the implementation of substance management and actually product submissions. We're also aware that to really cover the regulatory information management on products, you will need the full scope to really look at that as a completed data set. At the same time, other regulators are making steps in the right direction, like the FDA looking at PQCMC, or even the upgrades of SPL that are taking place. But of course, these all take time. Over the past few years, many companies have already addressed the typical challenges that IDMP include. And I think all of us have found that the key challenge there is what IDMP is driving us toward is changing from a paper-driven or even electronic paper-driven organization to a data-driven operation. That is a big change. It's a difficult change, and we run into many stumbling blocks. We do see that many of those challenges in there are challenges that we cannot avoid anymore. They're neither defendable nor even sustainable in the era that we live in, where so many industries have already moved towards a much more data-driven way of working. We see, of course, how many stakeholders of our product information are awaiting a data set that they can use in their environment, be it for review or be it for general use. So it's an important fact that these obstacles still need to be overcome, whether or not the legislation is being implemented tomorrow or not. Benefits of that are that if you go towards data-driven operations, we can see that the effectiveness of your pharmacovigilance and thereby your benefit risk assessments can greatly go up. Having that data available will make a big difference. The key objective, of course, is to increase the speed of a regulatory review. An important process to also make sure that medicines reach the market on time. And of course, there is great benefit for the many companies out there as it will reach the market quicker. That's all looking outside. But when you look inside a company, or even with the partners of that company, there are great means of having that information available at the right level of quality and certainly in an interoperable format. And finally, there's a lot of information out there on your product, and you want to make sure you can exchange it within the research and development that you do, both proactive and even later when you've been looking at the market for a while. So all in all, we see that many of the learning points for the early IDMP initiatives are on the table and are inviting us to do something with that. Next slide, please. This period, and we've chosen to look across the period of 2012 up to today, in which both XEDMPD and IDMP have been playing an initial role, we also see a number of positive items that have been happening. We see that there is much more awareness in the industry on the role of data, and in this case, even specifically on regulatory data, which means there is an increased involvement of industry, authorities, vendors, and interest groups to discuss what are the next steps that we need to take here, and what processes are interested in having this data available. And we've seen all sorts of examples there, from falsified medicines to even health apps that are interested in having the registered version of that data available. There is a clear increase in commercially available solutions for this. And of course, there are many RIMS vendors out there already. Perhaps IDMP has even invited new players to look at this space. So all in all, the need, the urgency, and the benefits of having structured product information are as alive as they have ever been, and they will drive us further. However, we also see that especially many companies, senior management, find it very difficult to feel that sense of urgency because they don't see the drive coming from external parties like the EMA at this moment. So there is no push from a compliance, there is no timing push from that compliance, and that means that many of the internal benefits that you could find are sometimes overlooked. And that unfortunately impacts many of the projects out there. Next slide, please. Let's look at those RIMS business implementations, see if we can understand what are the critical success factors, how you can make sure that you get the benefits from such implementations, or how you can even clarify them before your business case is actually approved. Next slide, please. Well, let's start with defining what a RIMS actually is. If you look for it on Google, then actually for the definition of a RIMS, you don't find that much. You do find a lot of commercial solution providers, of course, which also says something. And after a bit more searching, the DIA was very helpful and gave us this interesting definition of a RIMS. It says the tracking of product registrations, content, and other meta information for regulated products in a global enterprise to better enable decision-making about product portfolios. I think we all realize the role of tracking. I think the early versions of RIMS, and some perhaps even in Excel, have always aimed to give us a good understanding of what registrations we have or what registrations require work. At the same time, it's not all contents. It's also a lot of information about that dossier or about that registration, which we would typically call meta information, which helps us in reporting or even decision-making on which direction to go. And that's, of course, what information systems like these should do. They should help us in our decision-making processes, and in this case, perhaps specifically about our product portfolios. The second part of that definition says, codifying and maintaining of regulatory knowledge in a centralized and reproducible system. For me, the key word is regulatory knowledge. Of course, data is interesting. Turning data into information is really important. But if you can turn that information into real knowledge and turn that into something that you can make much better decisions with, then that is real value, and that's what we need to strive for. And finally, the planning of global and local regulatory activity so as to synchronize efforts for maximum efficiency of enterprise regulatory resources. I think we're all aware that regulatory professionals are sometimes rare, but at least expensive, so you should make sure that their time is spent well on the products that you have or want to have. And therefore, planning your regulatory activities can have a huge effect on the success of your marketed products. A nice definition to start with, and let's take some of these items later in the webinar to see how we can build them into your RIM solution. From our perspective, we felt the need to make a map of the typical functionalities that you could expect from our RIMs. We've used the description here that a RIMS is a system that facilitates and supports business processes for the collection, organization, and planning, storage, and communication of regulatory information. And we've chosen 4 angles to look at those typical functionalities that we've collected across the different vendor tools out there and that we would like to put in a comparison. Those 4 angles are process, content, data, and compliance and reporting. Well, let's start at the top, looking at the process. Of course, managing your product in its life cycle is a key aspect of a RIMS. Knowing when it gets started, planning when it actually gets launched, or even which variations need to take place, which immediately relates to the way you have to do submissions to maintain or launch that product. And that's a functionality you will see in many of the RIM solutions out there, the actual planning and tracking of those submissions. Those submissions, of course, have around them health authority interactions, and several of the systems enable you to record and document what interactions you've had there. The label is a very specific document and plays a key role in your regulatory activities, and therefore several systems manage your label or have a direct relation to the document management system where your label is managed, or even the translations of those. And finally, what I think from a process point of view is a fantastic example, the actual release of your product. There are examples out there of companies that will not allow you to release the product without going through the RIMS and doing the necessary steps in there. From a content point of view, of course, there are many documents that make up the approval of a marketed authorization. And many of those R&D documents will have a relation to your RIMS environment, although they may not always be in there directly. Which means that also the dossier itself is often not managed within the RIMS, but there is a relationship between the RIMS and the document management system where that is done. And the same applies to the label. Then there is the process of publishing, and there are some RIM solutions that have also gone into the area of publishing, but many still refer to an external system for that. Finally, from a contents point of view, you will need a regulatory archive, including the correspondence and the logic behind the decisions that you've made there, and this is where a regulatory information management system plays a key role. And a great example of that is, of course, the many answers you will try to give on inspection questions coming from your RIMS. Let's look at the actual data. There's a lot of product information in there, perhaps even meta information on your products, and there's a lot of information on your licenses. Well, that combination will answer many of the questions you may have within or on the outside of the company, or even some of the senior management questions that you may get. And then we couldn't resist of mentioning some typical IDMP areas in here, like organizations, substance, or even controlled vocabularies. I'm sure you see the overlap with the SPOR model of the EMA. And yes, we expect that many of the RIM systems out there, or future RIM systems, will act certainly as a repository for such regulatory information that needs to be submitted as well. But the actual version of the truth may well be within your RIMS, or at least may be referred to from your RIMS. And then there's the final process, the actual reporting or even submission for compliance reasons. And we've mentioned a few examples, and this is not complete. XEVMPD, of course, is a good example. There are companies out there that use a RIMS exclusively for the submission of XEVMPD records. An SPL is another good example. And of course, IDMP, SPOR, or any of those submissions like OMS and RMS will also make good examples of that. If you have devices, UDI is no different. And then I see two types of reporting, that mainly have value within the company. Specifically, quality reporting, where you will have a look at your processes and the KPIs around that. And finally, to answer the questions or to lead to knowledge on your product portfolio, you may do business reporting coming from your RIMs. I think we should also not forget the value that other silos within our organization can get from the information in our RIMs. And I think this is something that's happening more and more. Next slide, please. So in summary, business integrated RIMs should really facilitate your business process and help you in making those decisions better. That means that you should regard it as a golden source of the regulatory information you have, preferably in a structured format, should enable you to report on that business critical information and thereby facilitate both your planning, decision making, and certainly maximize the efficiency of the resources. The RIMs holds a very central position within many departments from that perspective. So many will actually want to use information from there. And of course, PV that will want to use information on the authorized indications, and of course the coding that will be done on cases based on that, is a very good example. But of course, within RA, within QA, but even within clinical or manufacturing, several of those examples can be given and should lead to an improved decision making, where product release might be even a good example to give there. Now, we see a number of trends that relate strongly to the RIM environment, both at regulators and industry as well. On this slide, we've mentioned a few of those items and how they actually affect you. So let's take the first example. An increased number of inspections that have a strong regulatory focus, even though they may often be focused at a different department like pharmacovigilance, and an increasing level of pre-information available at the inspectors. As mentioned many times, also in the US context, it is more and more likely that information that you've submitted through SPL or in the future through IDMP will lead to pre-informed inspectors that will know exactly what they're looking for in your context. It gives a higher level of transparency, of course, and considering that there is an expectation of increased communication between the regulators, this is what you should expect. And then it's important to make sure that the consistency of the information you have in-house and publish out-house corresponds to each other, and that you can answer the right questions. That is based, of course, on the requirement to do a number of data submissions, and IDMP or even PQCMC in the future are good examples, all based on legislation. And that legislation, of course, is more and more across the different boundaries. Falsified medicines is a good example where information on our product is basically collected, which can easily be compared in due course with information we've entered on a spore level, for example. And that will clearly drive this transparency as well. Let's not forget the benefit and risk assessments, where the fulfillment of those commitments and referrals plays an active role in that assessment. So looking at the consequences as an RA department, it means that the silo boundaries are very thin. You are pushed more and more to look at this information from a cross-functional perspective, and thereby also make sure that any underlying master data or data standards that you need to exchange that information are in place. The transparency also pushes that the product information that's in the public domain is consistent and preferably available, or even available in an interoperable format. That also means that if contractors or third parties play a role in the management of your product information, you should have the right level of oversight on that. All of this sounds heavy. Some of it may sound new, many things may not sound new, but they will lead to workload, resource, and budget increases in cases. And of course, from senior management perspective, there's always the drive to avoid that, to actually decrease the budget required, and therefore you will be challenged if you are maximizing the use of your automation, your IT infrastructure, your offshoring or outsourcing, or any other smart ways of optimizing the process. That means that the central role for a RIMS that's accessible for all can provide the information from RA as regulatory master data becomes more important all the time. Next slide, please. So if we take another look back at this picture that we just drew, where the functionalities of a RIMS are given in a map view, then several of the examples that I just mentioned have a relation to this. The product release is a good example of a cross-silo question or process, where in this case, the integration of your RIMS information with your ERP information coming from manufacturing logistics is a key element there. If we look at the reporting stream, then of course IDMP submissions, SPOR submissions, but also the upcoming OMS, RMS checks or submissions are an important part that is to be aligned with the information you have in your RIMS. From a content point of view, and I think for many of you the label will be a good example, structured authoring is a typical example that we can apply and align with our way of working in the RIMS to enable that process. And finally, which may be the most important of all, you need to make sure that from a regulatory point of view, you have a master version of the truth and that your RIMS can really act as a provision of that regulatory master data to corporate master data management solutions. Next slide, please. So we're trying to address many of these topics in the webinars that we do. So I've put some references in here, and at the end of the webinar, we'll show you the dates of the different webinars that take place for your interest. Next slide, please. Now, if we take the same slide as before, but we take an example RIMS in mind, and we've chosen to keep this anonymous, but of course, there are many RIMS solutions out there where you could do this comparison for. Then in this example, we see, of course, that some of these boxes are highlighted and others are not. If we take another example, then you may see a shift in those profiles, and I think that is key to remember. There is no one-size-fits-all out there. Different systems have different strengths and different weaknesses. And for different companies, you may have very different areas of priority. Of course, basic hygiene of your information is extremely important, and some capabilities you cannot do without, but other areas might be something where you're willing to look at other solutions. Next slide, please. So to take a more agnostic view on this process, on this entire regulatory information management, we've chosen to look at 4 dimensions. They're quite open door dimensions, to put it that way, and we'd like to give you some statements that we regularly see in the interactions with our clients and partners and vendors out there on what relates to that. We've chosen information, process, organization, and technology, which in our view covers the majority. Let's start from information. It's clear to see that the RIMS, can we go back one? It's clear to see that the RIMS in many cases is still not perceived by the business as the actual source of truth for regulatory information. Very often the document is referred to, or perhaps even a phone call, or other ways of finding that information are used. We'll dive in a few moments into more details what's the cause of it. If we look at the process, then I think we all realize that different countries, different regions may have specific requirements, different ways of working, and therefore one solution from a RIM system to cover everything globally may not always support everything. Furthermore, different companies may have different priorities, and therefore often a RIMS does not support the business processes completely and may even, in the worst case, turn into a tracking or even administrative tool. If you look at the organization, then many people in the organization will not feel the support from the RIMS the way they should feel it, which of course relates strongly to the way it supports the process, but it also says something about awareness within your organization of the role of your RIMS. And from that perspective, it is of course good to realize that the area of RIMS is still relatively new. So regulatory affairs, or perhaps even more specifically, regulatory operations, needs to uphold their initiatives, communications, or even marketing within the organization to show the value they're bringing to the organization by having this important information readily available at the right level of quality. And then the one that we always focus on most, because it is very tangible and it's easy to look at, capabilities of the technology. And of course we see that many RIM systems out there have a lot of capabilities. But we also see that we often don't use them as far as we could. We also see that many of the weaknesses out there of systems are not managed properly enough, and they can lead to issues within your process. Now let's take a slightly deeper view on each of them, and let's start with information. First of all, a high-level statement on all four before I do the deep dive. So our view on information, and it's again a very open statement, is that you need to make sure that you have high quality and consistent data available at all times. A very short sentence, a very difficult challenge, or in some cases perhaps even a very expensive challenge. On the other side, it's important to realize that if you cannot fulfill this promise, your RIM system will not be considered as a key source of that information, and many of your efforts will be lost. There are, of course, ways of making sure that you can achieve this, and that's something we'd like to go through in a bit more detail later. If we look at the process, then I think it is important to realize that even though RIM systems may have their standards of doing things, you should make sure it facilitates the process the way you do it and the preferences that you have. If we look at the organization, we feel that considering yourself as a supplier who is supporting many of the internal and external customers using the RIM solution that you have can really help you in optimizing the chain. And as we mentioned, at technology level, use the strengths that are available in your system optimally, or perhaps even to the maximum, and then make sure that any weaknesses you have in there are managed in the right way as well. Next slide, please. Let's focus on information. Very tangible. You might even call it data. It's the real contents of your RIM system. Why do we want it? Well, I think that's clear. We want to be able to find the right things in there and make sure we understand what it says. And that leads me to the first bullet. If you do not have a common set of terms across the different departments, perhaps even within your department, and certainly also with external parties, then it will be very hard for anyone to understand that data. And that is popularly known as a business glossary. Setting those terms is very essential, and in many cases it really helps you to use standards that are out there. Data standards like IDMP can help in there, but also the internal business rules that you may have on that data are key. Having your data cleansed, enriched, or restructured in accordance with that data standards is also very important. And we'll see some nice examples under the technology later, where, for example, the way you manage your product hierarchy or the packaging of your product hierarchy is something that can really help you in finding the right information. You should make sure that the processes to maintain that data according to those rules and standards are implemented, that they're clear, inspectable, and that people can refer to them. If you've done many of those things, then comes the cherry on the cake, which is the reporting. And I think this is not the only example where an IT system is implemented, a lot of information is put into it, and people do not see that information back. So reporting really is the way to make sure that your users are satisfied with what they're doing there. And I would say that submissions of information fall under the category of reporting. Well, of course, this should lead to benefits. It should be a solid foundation for doing your information management from a regulatory or registered point of view. What is our point of reference? What did we agree with the authorities? This information should then facilitate you to make an informed decision. And let's also realize that if you have a higher level of adoption and satisfaction on your RIM system, the way that the regulatory information is used will be much more clear and beneficial. And it has a lot to do with the way your RIMS is perceived. Is it considered as a trustful source of regulatory information or even product information or not? All in all, we consider this as fundamental groundwork for any future master data management that you may have in mind, especially from the regulatory point of view, but also interoperability of your data. Next slide, please. Process. Extremely important to focus on your process because that is what is driving your company. So, understanding the way you maintain your core product and license information is essential. And you will have your ways of doing this already, And actually, in some cases, a RIMS may feel it's pushing you in a different direction. And in those cases, it is really important to understand why is it pushing you in that direction and what deviation from your current process does that lead to. Is it getting better that way? Are there reasons for getting that control? Or do you feel your own process is stronger? Good examples, of course, are the way you manage your variations and renewals. But at the same time, you have to do a number of regulatory data submissions, which should also be clarified. We've mentioned business and quality reporting several times, but I think it's also good to realize that there are still many other processes out there, and those include periodic reporting, management of commitments, but also Q&As, or even replies to specific inspection observations. Benefits. A very nice statement. The right information is available at the right time, allowing for doing it right the first time. Sounds very corny, perhaps, but if there's one thing expensive in the pharmaceutical industry, it's time. So doing these things efficient, avoiding rework, especially in the last phase of your product right before launch, has a huge impact on the operations that you do. And having improved process oversight and control because you are capable of managing or measuring your process will really enable you to make the right kinds of improvements. All in all, key focus on process. Systems should follow that. Next slide, please. Organization. There's still a lot of people that have to work with your RIMS environment, and it is important that people understand the role. There are different types of relations out there. Some will be suppliers, some will be consumers, and it's important to understand that. Those are two typical roles, next, of course, to owners and stewards, that you would typically document in your data governance. Communication and information flow across the functions should be optimized. Easy statement, but if you really start analyzing how information flows from one department to the other and what role different systems play in there, you often find a jungle of systems and very complicated lines of information. Naturally, the benefits are very much in line with what we just mentioned. You are putting yourself as regulatory affairs ready to be the custodian of the structured regulatory product information and compliance information, which in many cases is the role that you were intended to have. RIMS data governance as a step towards MDM. Taking ownership of this information and having the tools to do that properly and to exchange that can really turn you into the steward of all this information. If you have an increased focus on your internal customers, you can look at this far more from a lean perspective and make sure your process gets optimized, and you can diminish the silo boundaries out there or even increase the operational efficiency. People are, of course, an important factor in this and should not be underestimated. And therefore, the way you work with your RIMS or the way your training is done on your RIMS has, of course, a key effect how people perceive this solution. Next slide, please. Technology, the last one of the list, and, of course, one that's very tangible. Now, many systems are out there, and, of course, we see systems where we feel there are weaknesses, where there are not as many or thorough system workflows that we would have liked, where, for example, investigational medicinal product information is not managed next to the authorized medicinal products, or where reporting is just not as up to the level that it should be. And of course, those should be addressed. At the same time, there are quite a lot of strengths out there in existing systems that are not used up to the level that they should be or could be. I've just taken two examples here, which are quite specific, but we've actually gone through. Capabilities to set up your packaging hierarchy actually completely in line with the new IDMP structures are available in several options, but are often not used, which means that your packaging information could already be IDMP compliant and ready, but you're not using what you have at hand yet. Another good example is the tracking of your product lifecycle, where relating the actual changes to submissions and included documents can be far better tracked if you set this up properly. We're an agnostic RIM system integrator, so we work with multiple solutions out there, which means we always start our discussion from a business process point of view. We advise based on the choice that you may have made or the choice that you want to make and look at the system's strengths and weaknesses, but we do put that in the context of your organizational needs. And next to all this, we try to influence technology development. We join several of the conferences, we talk to many of the vendors out there, and give our opinion on what we feel are the needs coming from industry and regulator. Next slide, please. So, as a summary, we feel that a RIMS can have a very big position in your organization, like we mentioned before. But we also realize that you don't do this in one step. In many companies, you are still struggling with making sure that from a vertical point of view, from a regulatory point of view, your RIMS is used in the right way, and that you manage the information, the regulatory information, within your silo correctly. But once you've reached that, it becomes possible to start exchanging that information with other systems or departments. You'll first look at that from a point-to-point perspective, and then very often pharmacovigilance is a very good example. But once you've passed that level, it turns much more into a capability where you are managing the regulatory master data of the organization. Of course, it helps if a corporate master data management platform is there. So also from a technological point of view, you can make sure that this is done in accordance with the right standards and using the right tools. In our view, these steps can be taken, but there's a lot of optimization that we need to do, and sometimes those are very detailed, nitty-gritty activities that you should be focusing on. Next slide, please. We've worked with several of our clients, our partners, with vendors, in looking at those different aspects that have a role in there. So understanding your RIMS, knowing where the data is, knowing how it maps to your organization, your documents, or even to external standards like IDMP is really important. Knowing which gaps you have, how you want to work with that, but also making sure your stakeholders understand what you are doing is key in making the RIMS successful. There's also an IT perspective on all that, where planning and setup is really important. Is the business vision on what the role of the RIMS is in line with the overall IT strategy? And how can we make sure that the business case can be successful and that we really define the solution that we need? After which, of course, the phase of implementation is really important. And yes, it is important to understand what you are implementing, and therefore we pride ourselves in doing actual implementations of these tools. If we look from a technology point of view, then it is important to make sure the RIMS has the right place in the overall architecture of your organization, but also that you select the right vendor to fulfill the requirements that you have based on a user requirement specification that you will have made. And next to that, actual validation, GXP compliant, is key in making sure all of this works the way it should. When all of that has been done and your RIMS system is operating, it becomes important to make sure it operates at the right level, the data is in there, that it's enriched where needed, that you can do the right submissions, and that it's maintained. And also in this area, we serve a number of clients and manage their ongoing RIMS information. If you'd like more information about this, please contact us on our website or other means. Next slide, please. So thank you for joining this first part. I would just like to inform you of the other materials that you can find and the next webinars that we are planning to do. There are some slides in here which will be available as well, which are the following slides that we can go through in the end that give you a high level of understanding of what type of services we provide, what type of information we take from the network to make sure that you can take your informed decision on which projects you should be doing. Next slide, please. Next to this, we felt it's important to also give you a practical case study at a client that we've worked, of course, from an anonymous point of view, and this will be published in the coming week on our website. And if you signed up for this webinar, which I assume you have, then you will be informed once it gets published. This was the first webinar. There are more planned and coming. So the next one is actually mid-November, where we will dive into the specifics of IDMP and basically have the discussion on should we be focusing on IDMP now or later, or which parts of IDMP, and how does that relate from your overall information strategy or even the requirements that you expect from the external world. After this webinar, there are a few more coming. One of them is how to improve your supply chain oversight by making sure that there is a capable link between your ERP and RIM datasets. We'd like to dive into the specific topic on structured content authoring, of course an area that's often referred to in relation to IDMP submissions, but also in general in optimizing the way you write many of your documents, like your labels. And finally, we'll try to bring all of this together in a webinar on the integrated information management, where all of these different sources can be compared and we can look at the next steps. Please register if you're interested. You're always welcome to join. And then I would actually like to see if there are any questions you have at this time. Back to you, Lin.
From what I can see, we haven't received any questions thus far. If you do have questions, please take a minute or so to submit it to us so we can address them. All right, I think everything was quite clear. As I'm not receiving any questions. I hope this was useful for you and it's been informative for you. If there's no more questions, I would like to close this session. Thank you again, Fritz, and thank you all for joining. Please know that we will do a follow-up with you with the highlights of today's webinar, but also we will also inform you once the case study is available on our website. Yes, so thank you very much for your attention. I would like to hope to see you all in the next webinar.